Oh my God. Hey guys. Can everyone hear me? All right, great. We got one person. Yeah, how's everyone doing? Hello. Hi everybody. So I'm gonna try my best to screen share this time. It did not work last time, so we'll try here. So far so good. Oh my God. Right. I need to actually have this closed or else I'm gonna have an endless amount of me showing up. Okay, so this is the first thing, which was me sharing my screen, so we have that covered. I wonder if there's a way where I can still see the chat. This is kind of confusing. I haven't done this before, so it's going to be a bit of a mess. All right, I'll just put like chat here, there. How's that? Is that okay? Oh, that's great. We have some people joining from Australia. It's early in the morning there. Some talk about schizoanalysis. That's interesting. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Because that's okay. I keep forgetting you guys can see my screen now. Yeah. So the first thing I wanted to talk about was I think last stream we tried to cover video topics. Do like a quick run through of what was mentioned. So somebody mentioned kind of jumping from idea to idea and disposing of ideas and having this sort of flexibility, which reminded me of Camus' chapter on Don Juan as like an absurd hero, and also like Nietzsche's idea of like the wanderer, and Deleuze's idea of like maybe the idiot in philosophy. But I think Camus is kind of hitting at a more kind of desire or passion based approach to philosophizing. And then yeah, so I'll go over the video topics. That was just like one example. I'm gonna talk about that had to do with kind of why do some, and then we will actually we weren't able to do last time. So yeah. So firstly, does anybody is there any questions beforehand? I'm going. Is there a way to just close this? I'm really curious. Um, also, just to stay on topic, you can like if you have a question not really related to what I'm talking about, I will answer them, but just as super chats, just to kind of incentivize people to not just be like spamming uh, in the chat. And yeah, I guess we'll just begin. Yeah, Don Juanism was one of them. Another one was nature versus nurture. So kind of the idea of like the anti-essentialist ontology as a potential video topic. I liked indigenous philosophies. That was interesting. I think I mentioned I wanted to cover Aztec philosophy specifically. Taoism, I think that kind of shows up in a lot of videos that I already do. forced positivity, misunderstanding stoicism. That one is a little bit, I think maybe it's a bit overdone on YouTube, but if there's interest there, I will cover it. The value of, a myth, the idea of like mythology. So maybe talking about Jung and Joseph Campbell, Buddhism and desire and lust. There's a lot of interesting texts there. Subjectivity of science. So talking about the philosophy of science, Kuhn's revolutions, like the cycle of revolution. Mereological nihilism, which I was not familiar with. Chat brought up. I find that really interesting. I would plug the Quarantine Collective as a YouTube channel. They do a really good job of dissecting the kind of, like Anti-Oedipus and Thousand Plateaus. When we choose our calling, I liked that kind of the notion of, free will when it comes to our upper desires. And the ethics of ambiguity. So Simone de Beauvoir's attempt at creating an ethics for existentialism. Is there anybody that's interested in? Okay, so we have the Hegelian dialect as one. Okay, doom scrolling, psychology. Yeah. Okay, cool. Yeah, and psychology and mental health. So kind of similar. Jung, maladaptive daydreaming, that comes from kind of a recent paper on that as potentially being like a psychiatric disorder. The twice exceptional individuals. I had not heard that term before. Derealization, logotherapy, Viktor Frankl's psychodynamic approach. BPD and artists. I am curious about that one. I would like to do more research on that. Carl Rogers in general, I find him to be just great in terms of if you're interested in being a good active listener, in terms of helping other people and becoming more relational. Psychiatric hegemony, antidepressants. I actually just found out today we really have to do a lot of research on psychopharmacology in second year. So I will be hopefully a bit more competent talking about subjects in that domain a year from now, but I'm going to start brushing up this summer. Experiential avoidance. And I think similarly doom scrolling. So people using their smartphones and the internet to escape from their present situation. Just like a general interest in BPD, as well as the dialectical philosophy of DBT. So Marshall Linehan's approach to BPD. I think that would be pretty interesting for people interested in psychology and philosophy. Psychedelic therapy, that's always pretty popular. The idea that too much self-awareness could be a bad thing. Thank you, Solarpunk. Psychological flexibility. That's an interesting one. That is the outcome measure in acceptance commitment therapy. And not entirely sure what the research is in terms of that being a valid construct, but I think it's really useful in terms of framing what is mental health, personality development, and neuroticism specifically. So talking about the big five, I always wanted to do a video kind of debunking the Myers-Briggs test. Also, AI and psychotherapy. I just saw in the therapy subreddit somebody kind of bragging about how talking about how ChatGPT really helped them through a stressful situation, and quite a few therapists on there were discussing, this is a good thing in some ways because they're getting that validation, but in other ways, good therapists are meant to challenge sometimes, and there is that necessary subjectivity from the therapist, and actually forming that alliance, that relationship, which isn't always positive, and these AI programs tend to always try to please. So, they're having a great affective experience when they're doing AI therapy, but whether that's leading to any substantial change in symptoms, I would be curious about. I know there was actually some recent research that suggests that AI was beneficial, but yeah, I'd like to look more into that. moral development, and addiction, which I think I previously or just this week did a workshop on like harm reduction and administering naloxone for people that have opioid overdoses. And I thought that could be its own video. That's quite an interesting topic. Oh, you like the art category? Yeah, I mean, these were all suggestions by you guys. So Wong Kar-wai, David Lynch. It's kind of really talking about specific directors and their approaches. Sublimation and creativity. I started looking into this, especially like Freud's interpretation of Da Vinci's personal life. Adolescence. Oh, the Netflix show that I need to start watching that. Maybe that'll be during the summer. Making art for yourself versus others. The extent to which it's kind of trying to gain some sort of status versus that sort of like Beckerian kind of just tossing something into existence to answer your own absurdity. Poetry is therapy. Algorithm being a risk for creativity is, you talk about that for forever, and I would really like to engage other creators when discussing that. Association between psychological disturbance and art, so perhaps relating it to the BPD and art topic. Existentialist art in East Germany. I was not very familiar with this, but it sounds quite interesting. Bob Dylan and transgression. I think that would be quite interesting. The kind of classic is suffering good for art. More on liminality. I think I will talk to IZAAK about that because he made a great video. Not a lot of people checked it out, but I'd recommend checking it out. It's he's talking about liminality and oh my god, what is the name of that Wes Anderson movie? But it's a very good video overall. And Lana Del Rey, somebody mentioned. I like Lana Del Rey. Jazz and spiritualism I thought was quite interesting, especially you look at kind of Miles Davis's later work. Little moments in Japanese cinema. I thought that might be a good excuse to really use the FX3. Is the art the artist? That's kind of a classic moral conundrum. Kafka, I think talking more about him would be interesting. Princess Mononoke, I think talking about I don't know, like when it comes to environmental damage and stuff like that. And I think he really does a good job of framing like humans with nature in a way that is novel and really makes you kind of disturbed sometimes, that I think other media, it doesn't really push people to that level beyond just like, oh, it's sad, like a forest is dying. Like it's really visceral, the way that he represents ecological destruction. I think I meant appreciating disturbing art, which is always good. I have some friends that really like horror movies, and I've always been interested in that. The urge to create. I think I kind of did a video on that a while ago about art and existentialism. I hope that's still up. I'm not sure if that was one that I got rid of. Bukowski, not super familiar with, but I like some of his writing. Jazz musicians and their ties to Black radical tradition, so kind of the politics of that. Speaking of which, politics, so do this quickly. Scapegoating, helplessness, radicalism, Marxism versus existentialism, fascism, very relevant, hegemonic culture of capitalism. On that note, Gramsci, I still don't know. Peter Thiel, and I think this, I meant to put Curtis Yarvin, two unfortunately influential figures right now. The ethics of avoiding politics. I know there's quite a few people who proudly discuss how out of the loop they are about the current state of things, and whether that is a privilege, whether that is I guess a valid form of protecting your mental health. Who's to say? Historicity. So I have Trujillo's Silencing the Past, his work on the Haitian Revolution, which I've wanted to make a video on for a while, and antinatalism, which is one I get a lot of people asking me about. Practical videos, these are just more kind of fun, easy ones to talk about. So how to read, I guess the way that I frame that makes it sound like talking to an illiterate group. It seems I'd say my audience, they all know how to read very well, judging by the comments. But yeah, how to read critically, how to absorb knowledge, how to absorb like what you're reading, um, how to get into philosophy. So kind of a similar thing, but kind of where to start, what to do. I had a very non-academic um, introduction to philosophy, so I don't know if that's helpful to some people. People that really want to know how to study it at like higher levels of education. I don't know if this is the best place, but just kind of getting your foot in the door, I can definitely, help with that. How to take notes and note organization methods. This is something that I'm still trying to learn in a lot of ways. I've experimented with a lot of note taking apps. And I think at the end of the day, pen to paper is probably the best. But, as long as you're kind of playing around with information, it's a good way to keep things in your mind. And just general book recommendations. I've been wanting to formalize some sort of book club. I have one on Patreon, but there's just not quite enough people. Reducing screen time. It's important, and I think it could relate to doom scrolling. How to Be Human Again. That was something that somebody mentioned, and I thought that was an interesting title. Maybe talking about how to get out of a rut, perhaps. And then finally, time management. So kind of a productivity thing, although this channel is not strictly a self-improvement, self-help channel. Okay. So any comments, any questions about that so far? Do you mean Kierkegaard's view on limerence? It's interesting. That's a good question. Tragic romantic figure in a lot of ways. Views on bed rotting. That's actually a pretty good video to do. I've heard people talk about bed rotting quite a bit. If I make this stream kind of a book club free time, which it'll be nice. In the middle of exams, a little tired. Also, apologies if my energy is not super up right now. Huge issue with people over-identifying with diagnoses. It's hard. That's a hard one. I see that argument a lot. The diagnostic tools have improved. Understanding of mental health has improved. So you would see a rise in people being aware. But then at the same time with social media, it's a bit of a double-edged sword because in one way, I was just reading an article in the conversation about ADHD, and TikTok is really good at making people think they have ADHD. At the same time, social media like TikTok, provides community and like with people that have those struggles, and can help them understand kind of maybe their symptoms, and they're not so strange. So it's a bit of a double-edged sword, like most things. People love to use therapy talk a lot. Yeah. I mean, I think especially in like relationships, it can be a little bit kind of subtly a bit of a subtle power move sometimes, because you are kind of divorcing yourself from maybe the emotional aspect of the conflict. And it's good to maybe just sometimes like be, just express yourself, even like emotionally, as long as you're being respectful and not ridiculous. Instead of there's that like in Tick Tick Boom, that one song where it's like, I feel bad that you feel bad that I feel bad. That's kind of that's what I always think of as kind of a parody of therapy talk with couples. And I actually think that it's called Couples Therapy is the name of the song. I think so. Okay. Okay, and somebody said diagnoses can just be a way to push med. That note, I got an interesting email from Butler today. He said he wanted to add to the video suggestions, and he said he's noticed that many people have a strong distaste of the field of psychology, some justifiably so, because methodologies for diagnoses are often very sloppy and not fitting into the way our society functions, and is seen as an illness. For example, there is an evo-psych theory that ADHD people were simply psychologically more well equipped to become hunters in the past, less of an illness, and instead just not as compatible with life in modern. But others just really hate psychology and think therapists talk perfectly healthy patients into being mentally ill somehow. I've been wondering a lot where this specific unscientific mistrust of psychology stems from, and I think it's doing a lot of harm in our society. I'd love to hear your take on this issue because I think you're intellectually well equipped to explain it. Also, your perspective on justified criticisms of the science would be super interesting. So yeah, I'm going to free ball this a little bit. It's a lot of different things. I would say, oh, you know what I could do? I could actually, sorry, I'm just going to share the note that I have open. That makes more sense. Here we go. That's a lot easier on the eyes, isn't it? How does that look for everyone? All right. So this person is bringing up a lot of interesting points. I guess, what do you think of this, first of all? Trusting the views of a therapist is always hard since no one can see the way you do. Does that make sense? Yeah. I mean, you could also just say that about like friends, and there is just always the issue of we'll never fully understand one another. But I think in terms of like psychologists are supposedly competent enough that they can go beyond that sort of subjective rift. Oh, you can't see the text? That's too bad. How's that? Is that a little bit better? Yeah, big pharma has a substantial influence in the field. Psychiatrists are usually the ones that prescribe, so I don't really know the extent to which that is really like a valid aspect of the criticism here, in terms of distrust with psychologists. I know that in some states they're starting to make it possible to prescribe as a psychologist. Yeah, I think. Firstly, I've noticed that many people have a strong distaste of the field of psychology, some justifiably so, because methodologies for diagnoses are often very sloppy and not fitting into the way our society functions, makes it seen as an illness. And yeah, like somebody's bringing up sane, that is common because it is hard when you make a diagnosis. You are also making a claim that there is some ideal form of, or at least healthy or normal form of human behavior and human psychology, human functioning, human expression. And that's never explicitly stated what that is. And the field of psychology has had a history of talking about what's wrong with people, and then never really clearly um, speaking about what does it look like when something is going right. What's kind of implicitly implied most of the time is that this person is fitting in to society. They're not causing a ruckus. They're not causing disruption. You see this criticism most pointedly in, somebody mentioned earlier, like the idea of schizoanalysis, where Deleuze and Guattari, I believe, are talking about how individuals under capitalism, um, they are kind of a product of um, the kind of collapsing of the reality that's created by, like, the nuclear family and stuff like that, which maybe I don't want to go into too much, because even trying to summarize their arguments is pretty difficult. But I would say broadly what they're talking about is, this issue of saneism, that um, you know is is it crazy? Is a person crazy in a crazy society? Which is kind of a bit of a cliche. I think Krishnamurti came up with that line at one point. And also, I mean, Frankl talks about like an abnormal reaction to an abnormal situation is normal, and if you really draw that to the point of like an individual having a diagnosis, if they're having an abnormal reaction to it, that's the mental health issue. And then an abnormal situation, which could be the conditions of capitalism, of authoritarianism, so forth, their reaction is actually normal. But yeah, like, what is normal? And there is a lot of the criteria in the DSM for different disorders is, there needs to be some distress. There needs to be some harm being felt, some impairment in functioning. And this is a fairly effective form of diagnosing people, where you are just really letting them kind of tell you, hey, like, I'm actually not doing that well. And that is also where you see maybe the most cooperative populations go into therapy. Um, and I don't know, like, that's good. It shows some insight. There is also instances like sometimes people, they do feel a lot of harm, but they, their rationale for why they're feeling the harm isn't actually related to what the, the therapist believes is happening. So I don't know, in cases of like OCD or something like that, somebody could be having marital problems, and they want to talk about how ridiculous their partner is because their partner won't like clean the apartment quite clean, and that they have like some serious contamination. Um, suddenly that kind of like that idea of like, oh, we can just talk about like distress being an issue, that kind of breaks down quickly. It's like, yeah, there is some distress there, but what if we're not even agreeing on what's causing it or anything like that? There is also the issue of insight, because there's a lot of disorders. I mean, OCD is one of them, but like eating disorders, personality disorders, where there is less insight than usual. And especially with like eating disorders, the individual might, be very reluctant to even like say that they're having any sort of issues at all. They might not actually be subjectively experiencing that. That is coming up in like physiological risk and like health issues, and like, the malnourishment you see in anorexia, or the electrolyte imbalances you see in bulimia. Um, it's very, very tricky, and those are usually not self-referred um, issues. So what I've seen is, in the case of personality disorders, they frame that as interpersonal disorders. And they really, some researchers really make the claim of like, hey, um, this is an issue at the social level. This isn't an issue within the individual. There's like something interrelational happening. That's the issue at hand. And we really can't make these claims of like what is a healthy or normal personality. Like, and I think like what's kind of implied is that a normal personality isn't just like one person. Maybe in like the Victorian era where you had like those etiquette manuals and stuff, like where people were very much scripting social behavior. It's a lot more diverse now. Like the kind of I don't know, range of acceptable social behaviors is a lot more vast nowadays. But you do get points where, like, if somebody starts screaming in a park, or if somebody does not want to form social bonds at all. So, like the idea of schizoid personality disorder, that is seen as unacceptable. That is seen as something abnormal. And who is actually making that rule? Why are people doing that? I mean, that's why like schizoid, for example, isn't considered a disorder, I believe, under the alternative personality disorders model. But yeah, I mean, if the individual's not actually experiencing any distress, that's it's hard to say that there's actually anything wrong with them necessarily. There is also the instances of like personality disorders in like the cluster B category, so like narcissism and antisociality, where there is harm being caused, but it's not to the individual, it's to other people. And yeah, that's like another issue. I mean, a lot of those people aren't going to seek treatment, and is this a normal personality? The whole issue of personality disorders is pretty. It's a pretty long-standing critique in the field of psychology, and it's like it's fairly prevalent. I mean, the most prevalent issues are like depression and anxiety, which are it's like more mood disorder. It's more like very obvious symptom presentation that the individual like is going to usually seek treatment for. And I think in those instances, I think it's a pretty valid field, but I can see um, criticisms launched towards the field of psychology when it comes to personality disorders, for example, where it seems like there is a lot more work needed with the diagnostic criteria there. Um, there's one guy, Alceron, I think, Alceron. He wrote a lot about how just personality disorder criteria is not going to translate across cultures. It was really designed by a lot of like white people, like the DSM-4 and so forth. It was designed by a certain group of people from a certain culture, and it really doesn't seem to translate well to other cultures. And there's this kind of cultural specificity that's really, really important. So just with that first sentence, I think there's a lot of validity to that. I would like to see, yeah, and I mean, this is correct too. Distress is very hard to quantify. That I'd like that you said that. There's Pollock, who it's not exactly the same thing, but what is considered like an adverse event? What is considered like something, stressful or harmful to an individual? The notion of stress, and especially the notion of trauma, can be extremely subjective. I think a classic example is, yeah, somebody not doing well, like a student not doing well on an exam. They get an A minus instead of an A, and they could experience a lot of distress. They could have very high standards. They could cry and scream, and then a kid in a war-torn country who's just seen some like horrific things happen to their family, they might not actually have much of a reaction, and they might not label that event as necessarily traumatizing, even though most people would. So trauma is also very difficult to quantify and to make objective standards. But I do think like within the field, they do try their best to have a cutoff point where, yeah, if somebody it becomes more about the individual's interpretation than maybe like an objective event, like an exam. You would start to look at more of like this may be like a rigid, inflexible pattern of that case, high standards, kind of perfectionism. And you gotta, everything's just kind of loose, unfortunately, for better or worse. Everything's kind of loose in this field. Stress would be less relative because it's more of like a physiological thing that can be uh, measured. Actually, this was in McGill, the person who kind of came up with the maybe not allostatic load, but the idea of stress actually causing bodily damage, physical damage. It was this. He was a scientist. He was a biologist, I think, and he was working with rats, and he was really bad at taking care of the rats. And then he kept dropping them, and he kept forgetting to like feed them. And he noticed after a while that some of the rats were like developing ulcers compared to the other rats in the lab that weren't being taken care of by him. And that's where he came up with this, this sort of model of stress. Of actually, after a certain point, it really messes up the homeostasis in your body, like your hormones, like you're kind of always in fight or flight. This sort of chronic stress like wears you down. These are like physical things that we can measure and we can see. And when you look at studies with poor low class populations, you see them suffer these like physiological consequences of constant stress. And I think there was a famous study with these British civil servants where, depending on their yearly income, you could actually predict their mortality, their amount of cardiac events, and so forth. So it's interesting. It's I would say stress is a bit more objective. I think trauma is a lot more complicated. I think it involves a lot more kind of top down processing, like how you see yourself and identity and stuff like that. So the whole, especially in child psychology, trying to describe what an adverse event is an entire it's a mess. Like there's a lot of researchers going back and forth. Does that kind of make sense to everybody? Are we dead ass right now? It's always the question. So I'm going to move on to the next sentence. So, for example, in evolutionary psychology, there's the theory that people with ADHD are psychologically more well equipped to become hunters in the past, meaning it's less of an illness and instead just not as compatible with life in modern society. So I'm not familiar with that. That sounds like an evolutionary psychology kind of hypothesis. And within the field of psychology, this is a very unfortunate kind of thing happening. Evolutionary psychology is like really represented in pop culture when it comes to people talking about psychology. Pop psychology and evolutionary psychology are very, very interrelated. You see like the rise of Jordan Peterson, where he really used a lot of Evo psych, even like some less bad individuals like Sapolsky, or going back to more bad, maybe like Steven Pinker, some of the people that Rogan has on his podcast, Lex Friedman, they really like to have evolutionary psychologists on. And it's because they are, what they're talking about sounds really interesting. It's very kind of creative interpretations of current behavior that we can use to understand things by going back in the past. But the issue with it that makes it incredibly unscientific is you cannot falsify any of the claims in evolutionary psychology. You can't go back in time and actually find out whether this is true or not. So it's a good theory that people with ADHD were more psychologically well equipped to become hunters in the past. We can't do that. We can't go back in time and do cognitive assessments and, look at the working memory of a caveman. It's not possible. We wouldn't be able to make those diagnoses. And I mean, I don't know, like one example is whether anxiety is, why is anxiety so prevalent? Evolutionary psychology, the interpretation, and it makes sense. And if people have read The Gift of Fear, it makes a lot of sense, which is the, anxiety. You do need certain people in the group to be high alert because they can alert other people to danger. And that just makes sense. Like it would make sense that gene would stay in the population through like reproductive fitness after a while. And that's a great theory. It's just we cannot go back in time and prove it. And when we're talking about things like anxiety and stuff, where it makes a bit more sense, uh, it's you can see the merit of evolutionary psychology. But I think also when you look at a lot of the research when it comes to like gender roles, where it is a lot more speculative, and you do note that, like, depending on what culture the researcher is from, and what gender they have, like what they're kind of reporting, and it seems to be like a lot more subjective. I think similarly, I was reading, Dawn of Everything by David Graeber, which is a great book. He really kind of goes against a lot of that Evo psych um, interpretation when it comes to, like, oh, like we naturally are very hierarchical, and he looks at a lot of different ways that societies were formed throughout our history. It's not always hierarchically formed. It's not always these rigid structures. Now that doesn't mean that we aren't hierarchical by nature. It just means that we have there's more variety. And by showing that there's more variety, it suggests that this isn't maybe as like innate or biologically essentialist as a lot of people propose. So with I don't know, with Evo Psych, it's a good theory, but I'm not sure if it's maybe the best point of attack to kind of like go after psychology in general. And then also there's like a second point to this. So ADHD people were simply psychologically more well equipped to become hunters in the past. So it's that argument that they're not as psychologically well equipped now. And therefore, maybe there's something more pathological about the society at large that these people are in, and not necessarily the um, issues they have that they're presenting with. And I think this is valid. Um, I do think at the same time, we need to kind of contextualize things and like what is psychology trying to do. There was a talk by Alan Francis, he was on the DSM-4 task force, and he's the head of the psychiatry department at Duke, and he's great. Like I would recommend people look him up. He came up with the whole term of like worried wells, like the people that overrepresent the clinical population because they can actually afford therapy, and it's just kind of like a lot of more um, kind of higher income people that have maybe more mild depressive symptoms, and he had a lot of regret not working with more difficult, maybe not more difficult, but more um, populations that were at greater need, and that always stuck with me. One thing he was talking about, somebody asked him a question about the current political situation, and what do you do with your client when they're if they're trans, or they're an immigrant or something, and he just said, like, he cannot change the world. He cannot change the current system. He can't change who's in power. He can't change the city he lives in very much. He really can't even change his neighborhood that much. But all he needs to know is that within that like hour period when he is with another person, that I think the kind of primary goal of a mental health professional, a medical professional, it's not going to be this widespread systematic change. That is going to happen more collectively. I think that what he says really resonates. It's as long as you think that you can make some sort of change at the individual level, at the interpersonal level, with the relationship you form with your patient, with your client. Maybe that is just enough to get things moving. And if enough people do that, then change can happen at a larger, more systemic level, hopefully. But yeah, I mean, it's hard. So to relate back to like the ADHD thing, it's yeah, it is likely that these people are struggling in a system that's maybe not perfect for them in a lot of ways, but you can't change that right now. All you can do is try to alleviate the distress, while at the same time ensuring you're not fully enabling the system that is uh, you know causing these symptoms to begin with. And that's a difficult balancing act. And I mean, there's a critical psychology and Marxist psychology that talks a lot about how psychotherapists can reinforce the status quo a lot. And I like to think that um, this generation of mental health professionals are doing a little bit better in that regard. Um, Ain't no way I'm watching this at 4 a.m. That's fair. That this would be quite a bit at 4 a.m. Do you think many modern mental disorders stem from no secular replacement? There's like some therapeutic approaches where they do like DBT, there's like a spiritual element to it. I think that you do see some mental health professionals talk about implementing more spiritual practices, because maybe that is like a basic psychological need perhaps. But I don't know. It's hard to implement that on a wide scale without causing a lot of issues at the same time. I think that's just a domain that we are still trying to figure out. Whether or not mental disorders stem from no secular replacement, or many of them do, I'm not sure, because there are also a lot of historical cases of, like, within religious institutions, people, like, I don't know, not doing well. There's a kind of historical examples of eating disorders with saints also. So it's not like God existing really made them any healthier in that domain. I also know plenty of people with ADHD. Yeah, I mean, like in this example, I think they are talking about like ADHD people were simply psychologically more well equipped to become hunters in the past. So it's talking about, people with ADHD that maybe aren't well equipped now. But there was a study recently where the like I think it's like people with ADHD, like adults with ADHD, when they have a lot of novelty in their lives, and actually like the more life demands they have, the more symptom alleviation there is, and they seem to actually be doing a lot better. And while I was talking, it was making me think that there are aspects of our current society with like social media and the kind of gamification of everything where having ADHD could be, I think some people, they say, like a superpower or of benefit. So I mean, it's gonna vary based on the individual, but I think I was just addressing the pathologizing of people with ADHD, and that it's seen as not good now, but it was perhaps good before, and that might be an indication that the field of psychology is, all messed up. Um, All right. So others just really hate psychology and think therapists talk perfectly healthy patients into being mentally ill somehow. So that just really makes me think of, I don't really know how to say this word, iatrogenic, maybe. Like you see it in dissociative identity disorder cases of like, or like countertransference, where it is true that sometimes there are instances where psychotherapy has been harmful to people. And all all you can really hope for is that we are just learning from this. Now, perfectly healthy patients, I'm not so sure about that claim, but like people that were very that believed that DID, dissociative identity disorder, was not real. They believed that like therapists were kind of baking these symptoms into their patients, which I don't know. I don't know. Like when you look at the research, it's very unclear, and there's like a pretty sharp divide of people that are, they believe DID exists, other people that don't, people that believe like, what is it, that the therapists are somehow causing the symptoms. And I mean, because hypnosis is also used as a form of treatment. So but turning people mentally ill, I'm not sure about that one. I don't know. um and then just this unscientific mistrust of psychology. I think it's just like a unscientific mistrust in general. I think there's anti-intellectualism is pretty it's rampant. I mean, we've seen the wide scale consequences of people being attached to algorithms that just feed them a reality of information bias and what they believe in, and we're all going to feel the consequences of that for probably quite some time now. But yeah, it's unfortunate. I think people are scared. I think that the notion of progress has really fallen to the wayside. That sort of Enlightenment era idea of things going well as long as we just apply the scientific method and kind of positivism and all that. It's not not looking so good if you can't afford groceries and you have somebody on the news telling you that that's look like you and that aren't from where you are, and if you vote for this person, they'll dismantle this like scary stuff that's causing the cost of living to go up and everything. And I mean, at the end of the day, I do maybe this sounds a little bit naive in terms of an interpretation, but I do think people are pretty terrified of what they don't understand sometimes, and I think that's where some of the anti-intellectualism comes from. And yeah, it's very unfortunate, but I want to thank Manuel from Germany uh, for the email, and I want to just say in general, if anybody wants to send messages like this, like these are great, and I'm happy to go over them on stream. And I hope this was like somewhat coherent. If not, it was at least like an excuse for me to rant for 30 minutes about a bunch of topics that I think I'd like to eventually cover on a video. Yeah, that is crazy. Mike Malone got fired. It was like terrible decision. But I just like, maybe he's not even that good of a coach, but so I'd be hesitant to call people that are skeptical of psychology as being anti-intellectual. So I tried to break down the paragraph the email sent to me, because for most of it, I'm not really addressing that. I'm addressing people that are skeptical of psychology and that there are valid critiques. Um, and also, I will say that like it seems to be the science that's most often proven wrong. There is also the argument that psychology has been the most upfront about the replication crisis. The replication crisis is a constant across a lot of scientific fields to greater or lesser degrees. And I have also I'm participating, in a couple of weeks in a like replication competition where we actually are tasked with trying to replicate psych data. And you're like rewarded for it, and there are like journals out there now that there's a concern about replication. This is a thing that pervades a lot of I don't know, academia in general. So I don't know, being skeptical of psychology, I think that's fine, that's valid. But I do think there's anti-intellectualism where it is just like a blatant write-off of things, and I don't think the anti-intellectuals would be able to specify anything regarding the replication crisis. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, no, I was just talking about the Malone firing also, just because I heard about that recently, and I just thought that was like an insane I don't know, just before playoffs. I feel like that if this was way more of a management issue, I think they got rid of the GM also. Yeah, it is the Dunning-Kruger effect. I think my average audience age is around like between 17 and 25, I want to say. All right. So what's next on the agenda? Oh yeah, I'm gonna finally this paper I found. So let me I think I'm getting a little bit better with the sharing and everything. I do have a Substack. I should probably post on it a little bit more often. But let's just take a breather for a second. That was a lot. Yeah, everybody's around in their 20s here. Nice, nice. Oh, I didn't even bring up Artie Lang. I have a video on Artie Lang. I'd recommend you guys check that out. The whole anti-psychiatry movement really um, emerged with like him. I think Timothy Leary also. All of them. Um, I think doing a video on kind of constructivism and anti-psychiatry would be interesting. Okay, so what do people think of limerence? Are you guys all familiar with limerence? So that's liminal. Liminality is spaces. Okay, so I actually found a little paper on that I thought we could go through together. Limerence is really just a kind of putting somebody on a pedestal. Like that is it's having like kind of an unrealistic, fantastical infatuation with an object of desire, an individual, um, to the point where it gets detrimental to the person's functioning. It's like romantic OCD. That's interesting. Okay. Let me see if I can do this again. And maybe I'll just put this. I'll put this here. Just because we have a lot of videos coming up. I'll start a goal here. So if you guys want me to actually do a video on limerence, I put up a little goal. And yes, Stendhal. I actually wonder if that's going to come up in the review and in the theory portion of it. That would be Stendhal would be good to discuss for passion research, like the dualistic passion model. But let me just see. All right. So this is a scoping review where they actually talk about limerence in like a very like academic way. So they explore the behavioral state of limerence and the relationship it has with rumination. And they talk about this in association with stalking and harmful human behavior, because what I talked about in my first video on limerence was that we do in pop culture we emphasize the um, experiencing that like romantic obsession, but we don't really talk about the object of the obsession. And I think the important aspect to this is that there are actually really bad interpersonal consequences that can harm other people when they are experiencing limerence. At the discomfort maximum, you have stalking and all that. Plug in here. And how there's limited literature focusing on the state of human emotion towards another person. One of the most common conversational topics, at least a lot younger. And you just see it so much in TV shows, you see it in music, you see it in film. It's interesting that people haven't really this up very much. And I guess, I don't know, are you at all surprised by the the lack of research in this. I would have expected a bit more of a commitment to the study of limerence beyond it just being like a literary theme. So I think I'll just start with the definition here, which is quite academic. It's defined as a cognitive state which involved involuntary, obsessive, fixated, and unrequited love for another person that was all consuming and intrusive. So that suggests it can actually be painful. It can actually be like a state that is unpleasant to feel this sort of like love or desire towards a person. Um, and yeah, it can result in harmful behaviors, interpersonal violence, and behavior of a destabilizing your own subjectivity, your own self worth on. And yeah, I guess this paper, it's a scoping review. So they're going to look over a lot of literature that has talked about it, and they're going to try to apply it to diagnostic criteria to better understand it. Um, so kind of we'll examine existing literature that focuses on defining the phenomenon of limerence before progressing on to discuss further. Uh, so erotomania, for example. So that's an OCD type kind of presentation where an individual becomes like obsessive about somebody who they have never met, they will likely never meet. So, like a celebrity, for example, and you see that sort of stalking behavior that just grow really to unhealthy degrees, and could result in harm to the person experiencing it as um, scholar, which is kind of funny. And here's some of the questions that they had for the research. In what ways is limerence attributable to clinical disorders recognized by the DSM-5? So I think it was really helpful that we talked about the DSM and the criticisms there. And I think stream I can talk more about the dimensional versus categorical approaches to diagnosing mental health issues. Secondly, what factors lead to the development and dissolution of limerence, which is a particular interest to me and to maybe other people. Are some people more prone to limerence? Where does it actually come from? Are we just finding people that are that amazing to fall in love with? Something makes me think that that's not the case. In what ways could limerence be viewed as being intrinsic to the development of harmful obsessive behaviors such as stalking? How much is it potentially causing these behaviors? I think it's highly attributable. First of all, defining limerence. How would you define limerence? Let's look at examples. Oh, was it a little bit choppy, the connection? 2022, Robert Williams, the third highlights. He was the GOAT. Unintentional worship and idolization of a person to the degree of ruining one. I like that one. That one's good. Ruining one's own self-image. So yeah, maybe gets to the point where how they see themselves is just they can't even take it. Not feeling worthy of them. Yeah, there's definitely a lot of issues with self-worth because you're kind of putting another human being who's just another person, you're putting them to like some extreme status, which is also simultaneously putting you very, very low. You don't often see limerence towards individuals that We are embodied beings that crave love, and this arousal of the passions which produces the most beautiful of very that's like a romanticist, like a troubadour type interpretation of limerence. I suppose for them this would be like the that they love, they eat this up. Um, Deceiver too, knowing he will eventually. Maybe you guys are doing that, but I'm in love, goddess. Yeah, some people, I guess they're just lucky. They feel that way towards somebody, and that somebody is. Yeah, that could be difficult, when there's maybe some reciprocation, but, not quite enough. That can even be more addictive in some sense. It feels like, "Oh, it could have been a possibility, but it isn't." Yeah, I don't know with complex PTSD and limerence, the relationship there. I know that there's issues with, interpersonal difficulties with complex PTSD, and I could imagine this might be one of them, especially if you also have issues of self-concept. What about perhaps identifying with features they have that you have within yourself, but since you abandoned maybe the best parts of yourself, you're not drawn to them. Am I making sense? No, not quite. Probably need to rewrite that, but I like where you were going with it. Um, okay, so defining limerence. The obsessive attachment to a person in which there is an overwhelming longing for another person's attention, who is referred to as the limerent object, or LO, cognitive state. So it's not an affective state, where somebody, it's like there's some thinking going on. There's real like mental processing, and you've kind of solidified the schema, um, pretty strongly onto this person. Get it from a crush, because the feelings of intense longing, they persist for years. They don't just come and go. You can still see people refer to their LO as a crush, but yeah, it is a pathological stage. And kind of what somebody was mentioning in the chat, that it's obsessive rumination that is motivated by both doubt. Um, so it's this fluctuation, this roller coaster of, and you can imagine that in itself becomes quite addicting, because you get your highs and lows. They come to class one day but not another day. They talk to you one day but not another day. Like, you can really like stake your self-worth on, and it's quite interesting that it can last for years. Is kind of a crazy. It's a bit hard for me to imagine, and I actually wonder how often I have like, I've definitely had crushes. I think people have crushes, but like years of obsessive rumination over another person. I don't even know how, like, what sort of life situations would like allow really quickly just becoming like unsustainable. Okay, the greater the level of uncertainty as whether the afflicted person's affection, the greater the impact of limerence. So, not like the unlikelihood of it, it's just like the greater the level of uncertainty. So if it's really hard to figure out if this person is, that actually seems to elevate the issue. Oh no, it's still getting choppy. That's too bad. I'll just wait a second so nobody misses anything. Let me know if it improves. I wonder if it's because I'm sharing the screen or something. Is the stream still pretty choppy? It's improved. Okay, cool. Maybe it's when I go off of this tab. That might be it. I don't know. I'm no idea, honestly. Um, okay, the effects of limerence can be devastating to those experiencing it and include, but are not limited to, symptoms of post disorder, depression, attachment anxiety, self harm, existing relationships. This sounds quite debilitating. That their theory that it's like potentially up there with like DSM criteria is perhaps valid. Like if it's causing that level of severity and symptoms. Um, okay, there's Sense Tenoff, who's kind of the person that solidified this as like an academic concept. Studies that have explored the differences between men and women intersexual found that whilst both men and women both experience lust and limerence, it is men that more commonly experience lust and women more commonly experience limerence. However, what is less clear is how limerence develops and the contributing factors that perpetuate or contribute towards the feelings being sustained or dissolved. So yeah, this maybe goes back to cognitive versus affective or slash like physiological difference between the genders that's being implied here, because um, limerence does involves some like higher level cognition. It involves some like real thinking and really like attaching to a person. Um, and it seems like it's saying here with lust, like they are driven and maybe more um, hypothalamic way. They're using their like lizard brain a little bit more um, in the stream. That's interesting. Stop moving the mouse. I will stop moving the mouse. I think it's probably just chopping because if there's any motion there, so I just won't talk. Copy. Damn. I don't think we solved it, guys. Sorry. I'll just let it calm down for a second, see if that works. Okay. It's the mouse. Okay. So the trajectory of limerence, how does this actually like, you know, map out? What is its core? So according to this article, there's so people are longing for love, but they've not fixed on a specific individual to assign them as the limerent object. That's making me think of like Zizek talks about falling in love and how it's an event that like your life um is like completely changed when you fall in love. Like it's that encounter that's so like cataclysmic. And I am kind of wondering like what this is saying is that the person is like actively looking for that sort of experience almost, which is like, are they actually falling in a way? Like they're longing for that some event, some collapse, some, and that anybody that happens to just kind of probably is attractive and at least except in cases of erotomania are potential partners. They could become the limerent object. And so the desire to be intensely loved um, is what fuels the limerence, not any rational or realistic reason for relationship development. That's another interesting thing. Um, it's the desire to be loved. So it's the validation, the motivation to belong and feel validated, and maybe not necessarily a more ugly or destructive process of what maybe some people would call true love, where you do have to sacrifice and give um, a little bit. And I guess maybe why. Although I wonder when they get into age, what's going to happen here, like what their claims will be. It seems like it's when people are younger, because I think that the kind of craving for attention and validation for your own more prominent at like younger ages. Um, And okay, pre-reciprocity. This stage relates to the significant and rapid development of interest by the limerent person towards their beloved, I'll say. There's not always an immediate sexual attraction. Sorry, I'm going to move the mouse slightly. Though there is the desire to be sexually active. That's interesting. Maybe a vulnerability, a need to um, feel vulnerable or something like that. Nonverbal indications of attraction are directed towards the limerent object. If these are rebuffed, this results in high levels of despair, which will gradually dissipate and be a state of limerence. So it sounds like even if there's like rejection and it seems unrealistic, they will repair. They will come back even stronger to the pernicious and persistent cycle of limerence. When they do reciprocate, this results in a period of intense obsession that may last for mere days or years, as there must be uncertainty for limerence to be sustained. This often reduces the length of reciprocity, as mutual limerence increases uncertainty and decreases the extent of the limerence investment. So that's an interesting observation, where it does seem like it's that kind of like middle ground where you need to kind of not know in the same way you're into them. Oh no, still slowing things around. Yeah, but it maybe if you just get to know the person better, it'll collapse things more quickly, because being in a relationship with somebody who is like limerent towards you would probably be off. And I could imagine that for the person who is limerent, it would be quite boring pretty quickly, because this the pedestal. Gradual dissolution. As the intensity of limerence wanes or dissolves entirely, there can be an increase in anxiety to replace it. This can result in a variety of responses, from blame to increased feelings of being deceived. Hmm. Yeah, it's that despair and distress that's maybe, I mean, this is why it's in the Journal of Police and Criminal Psychology, is this review, is that it's probably when they realize it's not going to happen, where you start to see the really ugly behavior. Post limerence. This is a stage when there's no trace of limerence that exists within a relationship, and a strong, healthy, communicative attachment can then be formed. And they say that this is a rarity to be achieved due to the highly emotive and conflict-driven state involved in limerence, which in individuals deliberately returning to a pre-limerence state, they often will search for a new LO. They will search for a new object of desire. So it's almost sounding a bit dispositional, like this. Like there are some individuals where they just need to constantly have that person that they are obsessing over, and it comes down to this need to feel wanted, the need to feel loved. But it's almost like, I don't know if this makes sense, but like the need for the need to feel loved. Like they like that yearning, like they like that, maybe it makes sense from childhood. If their parents or their caregivers weren't very I don't know, they weren't giving enough or something like that. That's like people rebounding on a lost relationship. Yeah, it does actually sound a lot like that. They need the high, and they're not looking for a relationship. They're just looking for that approval, because it seems like as soon as they get it, it collapses. You get that dissolution. Okay, they distinguish between limerence and So then they talk about how there's superficial similarities. So this is interesting because I don't think I would have been able to distinguish between the two. Um, so erotomania is a delusional belief in that someone is in love with oneself, with that person, more commonly than not, in a position of greater power and social status. Limerence instead is not a status or power specific presentation, and it can be any person on. Um, okay. The object of the attention is in love with them, and in fact, it is possible for the subject to have no romantic or sexual towards the object themselves. Erotomania is about the illusion of being loved, pursued, and obsessed over by another. So I guess it's that like they've already made the jump and they just believe that this person is in love with them, which I could imagine causes maybe even more severe issues, but also at the same time a real lack of insight. Whereas limerence is defined as unrequited love experienced by the limerent with a lack of belief in reciprocation. Um, what distinguishes it from erotomania? Okay, that's interesting. Um, yeah, and erotomania rare disorder with psychosis, which is what they're saying here. Um, and I would imagine limerence is more common because it also just seems like it's still delusional, but I guess it's like delusion how great a person is, whereas delusional about how much the person likes them. Oh, interesting. If it's comorbid. Okay, yeah, that makes sense. So ADHD being attached to reward-seeking behaviors and regulating behavioral impulses, difficulties in doing that. I mean, having kind of a limerent obsession would make a lot of sense with this constant pursuit of validation from another person, and it's probably very good in terms of distractibility. The person could distract themselves with this seemingly important goal, person's affection. Um, this okay, interesting. The sense of intensification is also applied to sexual romantic interests. The individual with ADHD can experience a rapid onset of intense feelings towards another, love bombing them with attention 1 minute, then losing complete interest and redirecting another focal object. Does anybody in here have ADHD? Just a question. Anything? I wonder where Freud would fit. I have ADHD and used to have a limerent crush. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Does anyone in here have limerence? That's ask that. Yeah. Yeah. I guess ADHD should probably throw up a poll. I have ADHD and limerence. Yeah. Yeah, I wonder. I wonder how common this is. So let me just see connections between cognition and stalking without first considering the behavior processes which may lead to a course of conduct amounting to stalking is tantamount. to addressing the problems on a superficial basis without first exploring the root causes, which may be identified and addressed through early intervention, preventing behaviors from escalating to a harmful level. So they are linking autism spectrum disorder with stalking behaviors sometimes and difficulties with, interpersonal issues and stuff. So they're suggesting there might be a link. In comparing ADHD fixated romantic attachments to limerence, it is possible to again draw parallels based on these traits alone. So they're really talking about that hyperfixation that you see. In ADHD, there's delay aversion where people can be in tasks that don't interest them, and they can be hyperfixated on things that do interest them. And I could totally see that being a solid argument that sometimes what people are hyperfixated on is another. Limerence and stalking. It's often characterized as an extreme expression of normal human emotion, where stalking is presented as a darker criminal side of relationships tied to a progression into harmful and typically. So this is where limerence might go a bit above, and it's going above and beyond what I think people are usually talking about when they bring up limerence. This paper, they're tying some traits of limerence to stalking, and I think this is sort of a preventative measure, for intervention and so forth, and also trying to understand stalking behavior, which I think, to me, that makes sense. I have always wondered, like, when it comes to stalking, that is a real extreme degree of infatuation with another person, and it I guess, the one thing I am thinking is with erotomania, illusion that the person likes you, which I think engage in stalking behavior because they would feel entitled to it. It would make sense. Whereas limerence, because there's that kind of the ups and downs, the hope and the despair. And it's about wanting to feel loved. I can imagine them doing like dramatic things, but I don't know if it would result in like sustained stalking behavior in the same way that like erotomania might, or some other like controlling traits that a person has. But let's see what they say. So there are several facets of limerence that are closely correlated to the basic tenets and may even constitute important precursor behaviors. So an obsessive fixation with an object of interest and a destabilization of the self to pursue that interest. That these are both common to being a stalker and being somebody who is experiencing limerence. But they say that it manifests in distinct ways. So the intimacy seeker type of love, which sounds a lot similar to the previous we were talking about, and is motivated by the aim of establishing an intimate relationship sustained by the fantasized idealized relationship, and which substitutes for real relationships with others. It is also the only type of stalking in this categorization system in which women outnumber men. That's very interesting. I would imagine stalking is predominantly a male activity. So yeah, I wonder if they're really like kind of whittling this form of stalking behavior being explained by this precursor of limerence in the female population. Okay. Subject's awareness of unintentional changes driven by emotional intensity. And then they also talk about the experience of the person being the limerent object and also the person being stalked. And they talk about how this actually varies. So the limerent person, I believe, yeah, they can be completely unaware of the like their admirers' kind of admiration, how much they actually really want to be in that kind of they want to be in a dynamic with them, I guess. Whilst limerence and intimacy seeking stalking share risk and impact. And then they talk about kind of different potential comorbid, like psychopathological correlates. And it seems like there is this maybe relationship of issues in behavioral regulation, in like stopping yourself from doing these things, like in general. Like you can't really, I guess, just be like, hey, maybe I'm going a bit above and beyond. But it sounds like the stalking behavior is truly like a next level kind of admiration seeking behavior that I don't want to say it's like the next stage, because a lot of people seem to get out of the limerence issue. And engaging in stalking behavior have also been explored through the lens of neurodiversity. So they were talking about autism spectrum disorder earlier. Interpersonal has been presented as a correlate. That's interesting. So I think we have interpersonal entitlement and behavioral dysregulation. So interpersonal entitlement is like kind of these boundary breaches and kind of expecting a lot from others, which, I mean, if you're really looking for admiration and being like valued and verified by others and loved, that would make sense as another correlate without really like, expecting much back, I guess. And they talk about attachment styles. So early attachment being disrupted, leading to insecure attachments in adulthood, and an over-reliance on others to meet their emotional needs can cause the development of obsessional stalking. And I do think also with limerence, that kind of fluctuation of hope and despair is something we see in insecure attachment styles. Stalking stuff is interesting. Of this one, this states is only maintained whilst the limerent has some form of direct or indirect interaction. Well, the LO, which fuels the one withdrawal or removal of the sense of precipitation of breach acts. Okay. And they're talking about the internet, which I could imagine its limerence in its like impact is probably increased with like online. You can look up people's profiles, you can message them whenever, you can go on their Instagram. I don't know. You can also like find communities where people are feeling similarly kind of obsessive, and that you can feel kind of validated in that sense. And yeah, so I mean, they've been using rumination a lot throughout this paper. So it's been defined as a class of conscious thoughts centered on a single theme that is persistent and repeated even in the absence of external cues or demands. So you see this in depression. People they will ruminate over like terrible past experiences or how other people think of them or how they think of themselves, and they get like stuck with that. So limerence, what's interesting is it's a bit socially sanctioned. So there's a lot of songs, popular media, and I mean, even when you're just talking to your friends, they're going to ask you like, oh, are you interested in anybody? Are you seeing anybody? It's at the top of your mind all the time. So it's a little bit more like socially endorsed to ruminate on, a romantic interest. Directly maintains attention on a desired goal and or state, and in turn repetitively reinforces the discrepancy between that and the current reality. Heavily impacted by the way in which people actively engage as a primary mode of communication, socialization, and self-representation. The internet offers a wealth of opportunities to connect with others through the medium of social media apps. It enables us to maintain, reestablish, and seek out new relationships, both overtly through making online connections and covertly via passive observation. And that's probably the more insidious of observation. And on that note, there's a lot of like studies with social media probably say like, oh, social media is like a really, you shouldn't engage in social media. It's bad for your mental health. It's not necessarily. It's people that lurk on social media that don't actually engage very much. They have often pretty poor mental health outcomes, and it's usually associated with high neuroticism. Um, People that are liking content, they're talking to others, they're really using it to connect and solidify relationships. They often have like higher subjective well-being. Okay. These connections are now primarily based around curated image exchange and likes engagement. And Facebook allow others, both known and unknown, others to believe that we lead. And that's interesting. So when people that are limerent are experiencing states of heightened distress and anxiety because of separation, they turn to the internet and specifically social media to gain access to the lives of the LO as a means of satiation. So thinking of that gradual disillusion of limerence that most people experience, this is probably like really stretching it and making it very gradual. It's probably making it very hard for people to just let go of the possibility that this isn't going to work out, especially if you can just look up pictures of them all the time. I like this sentence. Like solipsistic introjection is concerned with the development of a fantasy often created from the limited information we have about another person based on a tapestry of their imagined words. That is like a very, for like a research paper in the Journal of Police and Criminal Psychology, that is a really interesting. Like limerent, solipsistic introjection is concerned with the development of a fantasy often created from the limited information we have about another person based on a tapestry of their imagined behaviors and words. And I can imagine that with social media, it makes it even worse because you're just reacting to kind of the curated image of them. And yeah, you are kind of filling in the gaps, and how you're filling in the gaps is probably in favor of painting this person as like this perfect, perfect person. Okay, so let's. How do you actually treat it? Do you have to date the person? That would be one possibility. It sounded like that when you're looking at like the course where they kind of come to find out that the person isn't as amazing as they want. Obviously not going to always be, possible. And yeah, these authors talk about there is a notable absence of available treatment for related to limerence. And interesting, many clinicians report this too. But also, I mean, yeah, I guess like a lot of clients, they might. I wonder how much like person in therapy. I think it's hard when you're just telling you how much they really, especially if like their gauge of what's happening in that relationship or lack thereof is really subjective. If you can totally trust that, it would be hard to tell in a therapy session if experience of limerence or a case of limerence. So yeah, like always, CBT. Exposure response prevention. So that's interesting. That is a form of treatment usually used for OCD, and erotomania is also sometimes classified under like the OCDR section in the DSM. Exposure response prevention, usually with OCD from, and is people have obsessions, they are exposed triggers for their obsessions, and then they are prevented from responding. So they're prevented from acting out their compulsions. So if someone used to constantly clean. Um, I don't know. You would like make them pick up something from the ground and they wouldn't be able to like wash their hands for, starting at like a minute or two and then going to like 10 minutes, then like an hour, and like seeing, like kind of training them to understand that they can experience these triggers and those will pass and they don't have to engage. So I'm curious what that actually looks like. Do you expose a picture of the person? Just have to, I don't know, because it seems very cognitive. I don't know what behaviors or kind of compulsions are being oh, probably read. The subject is exposed to separation from the limerent object or is otherwise presented with a clear and unequivocal rejection. So maybe it's like you're thinking of this, or like the therapist is just telling them to go out and actually just get rejected. Yeah, it says it depends on the degree of excessive over. Okay, so exposure response prevention sounds like one valid way to handle this. So how do they conclude all of this? So uh, they talk about how they wanted to understand this condition better, to also see it potentially as a precursor to harmful behaviors such as stalking. Um, they talk about the fact that the person is able to seek treatment for, and a lot of clinicians, it can cause like a substantial amount of harm. Uh, the internet can really like up the intensity of limerence. Um, the association of ADHD and limerence due to the deficit in kind of behavioral regulation, kind of associated with behavioral correlations. And they talk about how the position that limerence is a precursor to stalking cannot be assumed, and they urge further investigation, especially because, and I agree with this, limerence states do not always progress to stalking behaviors in all cases. So that it does seem like that kind of alteration in terms of hope and despair. I don't think it would sustain stalking behavior. It could definitely sustain strange behavior that could make somebody uncomfortable. That's interesting. Yeah, they just talk about further research and everything, and I think that is pretty much it. I can post this um, somewhere after looking at this. I thought it was fun a fun thing to read on a Friday. If anyone was interested in that, looks like we had not a single person interested in a video on limerence, so that will not happen. Um, uh, yeah, I mean, what did everyone think of that paper? Worth not sleeping early. Well, you can go to sleep soon. Don't worry. Yeah, I didn't actually realize that it was the journal of like criminal psychology or something, which was interesting. When finding papers to discuss, how can you discern the wheat from the chaff? I mean, broadly, you just want peer-reviewed papers. You want to look at the journal usually, which I guess I didn't do this time. Look at the citations. You look at kind of, you can That one, it's like low risk. They were just doing like a scoping review. They're not doing an actual study. Um, but other papers, you do kind of want to look at the methodology, especially if they're getting results that are like counter theory. Maybe I'll make the target more clear next time. I said that pretty early on. Um, we'll stick around a little bit longer, but I mean it's a bit of a hefty amount, so don't worry. Maybe another time also. Is there any other topics you guys would like to see on stream? I don't know what I'm gonna do long term professionally. Who knows? Guess I'm doing clinical psychology, so probably that. The topic opened up wounds I forgot I had, but I'm okay. Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. Yeah, that's it's tricky, but I think it was like maybe good to just read about how, there's been some research on it. People are treating it as an area of concern. Um, that's good to hear. Yeah. All right. I think I'm getting really sleepy. I did a lot of studying today, so I'm gonna log out. But limerence is very close to my heart, and I am glad that you are covering it. I continue to struggle with it. Well, I'm very sorry to hear that. Um, yeah, people seem to want what they can't have. That's really, I mean, it was substantiated in that article that it's, once somebody actually, it's like a dog chasing a car. It's like once they have it, what are they going to actually do with it? It's the chase usually, which I think makes sense with the dopamine hypothesis with ADHD and everything. But yeah, all right. Take care, everybody.